Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center, and I'm the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. And tonight, our special guest is Dr. George Weiner. He is a Director Emeritus of the Holden Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Iowa. He's also the CE Block Chair of Cancer Research at the University of Iowa, and he is my friend, and he and I have served together for many years on the Iowa Cancer Consortium. So we're going to talk about all that. Welcome,
It's great to
George.
be here with you, Dick.
Well, it's great to have you here, and we were in a meeting earlier today by Zoom. So Zoom has become part of our standard operating procedures.
It has. I'm trying to get used to looking at the camera instead of at the screen here.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a good job. I'm being reminded of that myself. So I always like to get to know the person before we talk about your position and talk about cancer. So I know that you went to Johns Hopkins University for your undergrad, but I forget, where did you grow up? Where did you go to grade school and high school?
Well, I actually grew up just north of New York City and lived there until the middle of high school when my family moved to Cincinnati. And so I finished high school in Cincinnati and then went to Johns Hopkins for my undergraduate. And from there, I went to medical school at Ohio State. And then did my cancer training in cancer research at the University of Michigan before coming to Iowa.
Right. And then you came to the University of Iowa in 1989, I think you told me.
Yep. So I've lived here longer than everywhere else. I tell people I was born in Iowa and I just didn't know it.
Yeah. Well, people sometimes get Ohio and Iowa mixed up, but let's go back to high school. So you graduated from high school in Ohio. What was your claim to fame in high school?
Well, my claim to fame was that I was a member actually of the state championship soccer team.
Awesome.
But the only reason we were the state championship soccer team is we had 3 exchange students from Argentina. And so the rule was let them handle the ball, don't be offside.
Just get out of their way.
That was it.
Well, I did not know that about you. So state soccer champion. And when did you when you went to Johns Hopkins, did you kind of know you wanted to go into medicine, or what was your first declared major when you went to Baltimore?
Well, I had what they called an area major. I was a natural science major, and I knew I liked science. I was intrigued by medicine, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. And so I took just a broad array of science classes. And then gradually, as I approached my senior year, I realized that medicine was the direction I wanted to go. But I always felt that I wanted a research aspect to my career as well, not straight clinical practice, because I enjoy both of them and the intersection between the two.
Yeah. So did that interest in research, did that precede college, or it was your science classes and all the labs in college that piqued that interest?
Well, I kind of had a interesting first job when I was a senior in high school that carried through college, and that was my job was to go to the farm and bleed goats for an immunology lab.
Okay.
And
wow.
that was in the day before there were regulations. So we would go immunize goats with immune system proteins. And then I'd go back a few weeks later and collect the blood, and we would study the antibodies in the goat blood. But my job wasn't to do the science; it was to hold the goats while we bled them.
Right. It was more of a vet tech than a scientist.
That was it. But as the years went on, they allowed me to do more and more. Mm-hmm. And that was really what got me interested, I think, not only in science, but in the immune system.
Gotcha. So I'm thinking of my experience. So in undergrad, I was chemistry, microbiology, lots of labs. But then in medical school, the 4 years of medical school, I don't remember having any experience that I would say was anywhere near research.
Yeah.
So what was your experience in medical school? And did you have the opportunity to be involved in research projects in medical school?
I did not. And part of the reason was I sort of thought when I'm training clinically, that's what I want to focus on. And
Mhm.
at the time, Ohio State had an experiment where they were pushing students through medical school in 3 years instead of the usual 4. And that just didn't allow time for research.
Right.
So I always knew I was interested in research, but I focused on clinical medicine during that period of time.
So then, as you said, as a medical oncologist, hematologist, medical oncologist, you do internal medicine first, and then
Yeah,
you do the fellowship. And was it during your fellowship that you got more actively involved in your own research projects?
exactly. So I did my first year of fellowship was straight clinical. Then the next year was half clinical and half research. And then I actually stayed on for a couple more years where I was 80% research and only had 1 day a week of clinic.
Gotcha.
And that was really the minimum necessary at the time for me to feel comfortable in the research lab.
When do you develop what you would consider your own field of research? I would imagine that when you first show up in the lab and you start, you get assigned, I assume, to someone else's lab and you help them work on their projects. And then at some point, you decide what it is that your project or your area of research is going to be.
That's exactly right. It's really an apprenticeship. So you try to identify a mentor who you think is working in an area that you're interested in and that you mesh with from a personality point of view. That's really important as well. Although another piece of advice I give to my trainees, and I have PhD students and MDs and medical students in my lab, is that you don't always have to work in the lab of someone who's working in the same field you want to work in on your own. Sometimes what makes sense is learn a new skill and then apply it to a new area. And
Okay.
so the idea is that you work as an apprentice in one lab, but then when you start your own lab, you can start working in a different area, but apply those new tools you've learned. And that's where a lot of the great advances come when someone trains in one area and then applies those skills to another area.
So you came to the University of Iowa in 1989 as assistant professor,
Yeah.
and you had a lab, and you also were seeing patients. With your very first lab that you had at the University of Iowa, was that embarking on what is now your area of expertise, or has your primary focus changed over the years in terms of your research focus?
The research focus, I would say, in generally has changed, but it's like going from a Model T to a Tesla. I mean, we're still trying to do the same thing, but the tools are just incredibly different at this point. So
Mm.
I've always been interested in cancer and the immune system. And in fact, when I first started working in that area, what we call cancer immunotherapy had not been very effective. And some of my mentors told me I was throwing my career away, that we'd never be able to use the immune system to treat
Wow.
cancer. Um, what convinced me otherwise is that the treatments didn't work well for many people, but when they worked, they could work spectacularly well. So a
Mhm.
new treatment might be tested in 100 patients. 98% of them, it wouldn't work at all, but the two for whom it helped, it had an enormous impact. And that told me there's something there, but we just don't understand it. We need to do more research to figure out what's going on.
And I'm thinking back again, I'm not a researcher, but when I first became aware of it, I think I was at NCI and Bethesda, and they were starting to do some interferon studies as some of the first clinical immunotherapy. Is that, or was there something before that hit the clinical fields?
Well, the actual first immunotherapy was done back in the late 1800s. And this was done by a surgeon named William Coley, who was at Memorial at the time. And he heard the case of a patient with a cancer who got an infection, and the cancer melted away. So he took live bacteria and injected it into the tumors of patients. There were no ethical regulations. There was no informed consent. It was a very different time. But he had a couple patients who did well. He had a couple patients who almost died from infection also. But it wasn't really very reproducible. Yet it's interesting to think that the field of immunotherapy actually predates radiation or chemotherapy as a treatment of cancer. It's just that there was really no idea what was really going on.
Wow. Yeah, and now that you mention it, I think of, BCG for
Yeah.
bladder cancer, and maybe explain what that is and how that's related to immunotherapy and to also microbiology.
Yeah. Well, BCG is sort of a very, very weak tuberculosis bug. So it can't cause real disease, but what was found out, and again, this was done before there were a lot of ethics involved, is that if you took these BCG bugs and put them into the bladder of some patients with bladder cancer, the cancer would shrink away. And so it's still used in some patients today, and we're still trying to really understand exactly how it works.
Are there any other examples of using viruses or bacteria to stimulate the body's immune response and then having the secondary benefit of controlling cancer?
Well, yes, and actually, one of my major research projects right now involves doing exactly that. But what we're using is not an actual virus, but it's a pretend virus. So we've concocted this virus that has a protein on the outside, and on the inside of it, it's not infectious, but it carries a very, very strong agent that stimulates the immune system. So when we take this pretend virus and inject it into the cancer, the immune system rushes in saying, 5-alarm fire, what's going on here? What should we do? And they don't find an infection, but they find the cancer. And what we're finding is that is a way of breaking through the ability of the cancer to hide from the immune system and getting the immune system to recognize that the cancer doesn't belong. So it's actually working in some patients, not in others. And we're trying to figure out why it works sometimes and why it doesn't work other times.
So the patients that you're using this on, is this a new enough agent that it's considered a phase 1 study?
It's in the phase 1, phase 2 now, and we're combining it with other treatments that we think, studying in my lab, one of the things we do is we treat patients with this, and then we're able to take cells out when we inject to look at what's going on in what we call the tumor microenvironment. What is going on in a very complex setting where there are cancer cells and immune cells, and they're bumping up against each other, and sometimes they're dancing and sometimes they're ignoring each other. How do we change that microenvironment in a way that allows the immune system to recognize the cancer and fight it? And so we're looking at that at the cellular and at the gene level right now. And that information is giving us clues as to how we can make this treatment better.
Give us a sense for the time span that it takes from when you first see something or have the idea to where you are now with actually using this concept to treat human beings.
Well, it's really very varied. It's a very winding path. It's not a straight road where you say, okay, here's my idea, I'm going to test it, and then it'll work in patients, and we're off to the races. Very often, you'll try a treatment. You'll see it helps some people. It doesn't help others. You try to figure out why. Sometimes you have to take a step backward and redesign the treatment when you realize that maybe it wasn't designed the best way possible. So it takes many, many years to go from one end to the other. And it's a never-ending process. It's, we never should be satisfied with the treatments we have. We always want to learn more so that 10 years from now, we look back and say, oh, boy, were we primitive 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, anybody who watches TV, sees Keytruda and Opdivo and even people who just casually pay attention to medical science are aware of immunotherapy and the role it plays. So one question I have for you, when you're at a university setting and you're doing this exciting research and now you're actually testing it on patients, at what point do pharmaceuticals and drug manufacturers and everyone want to partner with you, collaborate? Where does what happens with the intellectual property at a university setting? Maybe just give us a sense for how that, what's the landscape nowadays? I think we all are aware of how expensive some of these drugs are, and once they become a blockbuster, how important they are to pharmaceutical companies' bottom line. How do you, as a science researcher, you can't obviously just ignore the fact that there's potential out there. What's the process by which you, as a researcher, engage with pharmaceutical companies as you're developing a potentially new and exciting treatment?
Well, it's complicated, and it is a partnership. So what we'll do is, if we come up with an idea that we think has commercial potential, we'll work with the university to submit a patent to protect the intellectual property. And it's not because we want to make a bucket load of money. It's because we know that to bring these ideas to where they help people takes a huge amount of resources, and that we need support from industry to have that take place. So in some cases, the intellectual property will be licensed to a biotech company or a pharma company, who will then take over and continue the research. This particular example I just told you about with the virus-like particle, the pretend virus, that whole concept was developed by a colleague of mine who went and started his own company to test that. And then once it showed promise, a much bigger pharmaceutical company went and bought it. It takes tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to take these ideas to the point where they help patients, and we don't have those resources. So our idea is, we do the discovery work, we do some of the basic science, and then we'll collaborate with industry with the hopes of advancing these to where they can help patients.
And are we talking 10, 20 years from the point that you first start to see some scientific merit until you end up with a product that is commercially available?
Well, I guess it depends where the starting line is.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you come up with an idea and you think it might have benefit, but you don't even have an understanding of how you might use it until you do more research. So I think it's really hard to know both where the starting line is and where the finish line is, because it's there's a lot of background that goes into coming up with these concepts.
So we've been talking about a treatment that you're working on that would fall into the category of immunotherapy, and we touched a little bit about some of the more famous immunotherapy drugs. What would you say are other fields of research right now that you're aware of that excite you about the potential for developing new treatments in the world of cancer care?
Sure. Well, traditionally we think of three branches of cancer care, and you and I together cover two of the three. So those are radiation therapy, chemotherapy, and surgery. And that's how we've treated cancer for decades and decades. We now have two other major approaches to treating cancer. We just talked about one, which is immunotherapy. And the final one is what's sometimes called targeted therapy or precision oncology. What we're learning is, down to the very level of the individual pieces of DNA, what goes haywire in some cancers to cause the cancers to behave the way they do. And one of the real challenges of this is we've learned that, in fact, cancers are incredibly individual, that in just about every patient, the cancer has its own mutations, and two cancers that look identical under the microscope can have very different underlying causes and respond very differently to treatment. And we're now able to produce some drugs that go specifically towards the abnormality in that individual cancer. One way to identify them, a lot of them end with the last initials NIB. So we talk about the NIBs sometimes. And those are targeted drugs that, at least for some patients with cancer, can be incredibly effective with relatively fewer side effects.
And some of these, when we do an assay of a cancer cell, as you already alluded to, back in the olden days, not that long ago, we had a pathologist look at the cancer cell under the microscope and give it a name, and that became the name of the cancer, and we use treatment based on that. Now we look at many different factors of the cancer cell. We might be looking at the DNA of the cancer cells, or the proteins on the surface, or the receptors on the surface, or a number of other characteristics that allow us to have sort of a fingerprint of the cancer. Um, Once I heard, one of the first times I heard you speak, you gave a talk on genetics and epigenetics. And that was the first time I'd ever heard the concept of epigenetics. And I'm kind of interested in where that leads us in terms of cancer research. So maybe just describe a little bit what genetics are. Most people have heard of like BRCA1 and BRCA2 as genetic mutations in the human that might predispose to cancer. Maybe distinguish what genetics and epigenetics are and the role that it may play in cancer.
Okay, we need a few hours, but let's see what I can do in about 5 minutes here. What I'd like to start out with is when we talk about cancer genetics, we really talk about it in two different ways. Every cell in our body has DNA and genes that we inherited from our parents. And sometimes when we talk about BRCA and cancer predisposition syndromes, that's based on the DNA that's in every cell in our body that we inherited from our parents. Now, when a cancer occurs, sometimes there are changes in that genetics that result in giving the cancer cell the ability to grow, whereas the rest of the cells in the body don't. So that results from a mutation in the gene. So sometimes when we talk about cancer genetics, we talk about testing the genetics of every cell in your body, by studying it from the blood or even by saliva, even the skin. You can sometimes test genetics that way. But we also like to look at the genetics of the cancer cell itself and see how those are different from the cells in the rest of the body, because that gives us the chance to target those cancer genetic abnormalities. So that's two different ways cancer genetics is used, either what we call host genetics, which is the genetics in the whole body, or the cancer genetics itself. Now, this can get a little technical, but one of the reasons that the DNA impacts on how our bodies behave is that the DNA is read by the body, and the genes that are in the DNA get converted in some cases to proteins, and that's what tells the body how to behave. Well, the concept of epigenetics is that, in fact, there are other processes that control which genes get read out and which genes stay in the back shelves of the library and nobody ever looks at them. And that's called epigenetics. And epigenetics can also impact on how the body functions. So obviously, if some genes are up in the front of the library and people are checking out those books all the time, they'll have more of an effect on the cancer, if that's what we're talking about, than those genes that are on those back shelves and never see the light of day. So we're beginning to learn about this epigenetic control. And there are some drugs now that can modify that can change which books are in the front shelf and which are in the back shelf. And that can impact on how a cancer behaves and how it responds to cancer treatments.
Right. So it's kind of like switches that turn them on and off, and some genes become more prominent, and factors that might be environmental or even what we might consider social
Yeah,
stresses can actually have effects on the genes.
that's right. And some of these effects might last for a long time. We don't really know. It's an area of active study to try to understand why some populations, such as those underserved people in the inner cities or in rural communities, have higher rates of some cancers, and it may be because of their living conditions and the stress that they go through every day could impact on the likelihood of getting cancer. We really don't
Right.
know, and that's an active area of research.
And as I understand it, one of the theories is that perhaps social stress has an epigenetic effect on the individual, but that the offspring spring of that individual, their genetic makeup could be affected by the social stress of the parent.
Yeah, that's, I'd say, a little more controversial.
Okay.
I think there's some evidence for it and some not, and it's going to be an area of, I think, a really important research in the years ahead.
Okay. So when I introduced you, I gave several of the titles. So you're an amazing person who is equally conversant in clinical medicine, the actual taking care of patients, and research, but also you served for 23 years, I think, as the director of the Holden Comprehensive Cancer Center, a huge administrative job. So, as I've known you, you've been doing all three of those, juggling clinical practice, um, research, and also administrative uh, of a large cancer center. What do you think are your special attributes that allow you to do all three of those things so successfully?
I was going to say I like pain, but uh, that's not true. I'm not sure I'm any better than anybody else, but I think one of the things that all three of those really require is an ability to see through the noise. You know, when in all those cases, you're getting bombarded by information, and you have to decide which pieces of that information are important and which are not. You know, when you're seeing a patient, if the patient says they have a headache, is that a sign of the fact that they didn't have coffee that morning, or is that a sign of some bad infection or some other problem? And you have to figure out how to sort through that information and think about what's important, and then be able to envision what the future might hold based on whatever decisions that you're thinking about making. So I think that's a general skill set that applies to clinical medicine, it applies to research, and in fact, it applies to administration when you're trying to decide which issues, where do you focus when there's so many needs and sometimes not as many resources.
And over the course of your career, um, have those three jobs had various order of enthusiasm? Have you enjoyed one more than other at different times in your career?
Oh, definitely. And I would say that, I first started out, I love to see patients and to do clinical medicine. But one of the challenges that you know so well is that sometimes it's a little hard to control your calendar and your clock when you're taking care of patients, because when your patients need you, they need you, and you need to do that. And if you're busy in the research lab and a patient calls, you drop what experiment you're doing and figure out what you need to do for the patient. And then as I got more involved in administration and policy and traveled to a lot of meetings, taking care of patients got harder and harder because, I would, get off the airplane and have three calls waiting for me, and would be running to a meeting trying to take care of problems. So it's been a challenging balance through the years. And The other fact is that I did find over the last few years that I was so busy with research and so busy with administration that I wasn't spending as much time as I wanted keeping up on just being a good doctor at a time when my field was getting so incredibly complicated. So I pretty much backed off seeing patients, not because I didn't love it and enjoy it, just that I felt that where can I make the best contribution at this point in my career? And I think it's, at this point, it's more in the research area and then working with doing consulting in large collaborative groups. A very exciting area I'm involved in now is I'm currently chair of a large group called the Oncology Research Information Exchange Network, which is 19 cancer centers that have worked with patients to gather the genetic information on cancer from thousands and thousands of patients to try to find those signatures of which treatment's going to work on which patient. And helping coordinate this whole effort requires knowledge of research, it requires knowledge of clinical medicine, and it requires some administrative skills as well.
And is this part of Cancer Moonshot? And is this one of these things where AI can? So, for example, on NPR this morning, they're using AI to feed the computer all sorts of EKG strips on patients who ultimately developed atrial fibrillation, so that perhaps AI can look at a EKG of a patient now and determine, are they likely to develop atrial fibrillation in the future? Are these sorts of computer programs that go through reams and reams and reams of data the type of programming that would be used to look at all of the factors of these tumor specimens to determine some commonalities or pick out some pieces of information that might be clinically relevant?
Absolutely. I mean, we have, if you look at the DNA sequencing and the RNA sequencing we have on our patients, we have about 50,000 patients who have volunteered to have this tested. And on each one of those, we have millions of pieces of information. So you're not going to figure that out on an Excel spreadsheet. So we definitely use computers and AI to sort through the information. I would say that right now, they're used as tools to identify patterns. It still requires people to understand what those patterns mean, how they're going to impact on patients. So at least in my field, AI is a wonderful tool, but not to the point where it's going to replace any of us.
Okay. So you've had a long and illustrious career in cancer. Two questions. One is a little bit of a repeat of a question I asked you earlier, but what are you most excited about seeing come to fruition over the next decade or so, based on your knowledge of all the research that's being done around the country? And then second, I'll ask you, what are you most concerned about in terms of the way we either take care of our environment or the way we practice medicine in the United States? Let's go with the upside first. What are you most excited about in terms of cancer care?
Well, we're making progress in cancer research faster than ever before. And we're seeing new treatment approaches emerge. And we're able to help patients now who 5 years ago we had very few tools with. And I see this progress accelerating, not slowing down. And in fact, I tell my students and mentees that I came through about 15 years too early, that the first 15 years of my career, the progress was there, but it was slow. And, we tried different chemotherapy regimens. Some might be a little better than others. But boy, our ability to impact on patients and the quality of their life and help them, in a lot of cases, really we didn't have much in the tool chest. And that is changing. And so it's just incredibly exciting to see that happen. That does lead me to my concern that as we move forward, these new treatments become more individualized and they become more expensive. And access to these treatments is not uniform. And access to these approaches is not uniform. So it's wonderful to make advances, but we have to figure out how to be sure those advances are available to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And, the expense to develop these new treatments is in the research. So once you've done the research, we should make these treatments available to everybody, because it's not going to cost that much more. I mean, you spend, hundreds of millions developing a new targeted therapy for a cancer, but then making each pill costs $5. Why are we rationing them at that point in time when we've already spent the money as a society to develop these wonder drugs? So that's so the two pieces are connected. What is most exciting and what worries me about the field of cancer at this point.
Yeah. The Cancer in Iowa report came out earlier this year, and somewhat surprisingly, Iowa is number 2 in the country in terms of incidence of cancer. And there's been a lot of speculation as to why we are number 2. Number 1, as you know, is Kentucky. And one of the reasons they're number 1 is they have some of the highest smoking rates in the United States. And cigarette smoking is still the number 1 modifiable risk factor that contributes to the incidence of cancer. What are some of the important nuances of the Cancer in Iowa report that listed Iowa number 2 in the country, and what's some of your takeaways and your thoughts about why we might be so high up in cancer incidence compared to other states?
Yeah, it's incredibly disappointing news. We don't really understand the reasons, and I don't have any particular insight into why our numbers look so bad. Some of it is lifestyle, and certainly we know that obesity is associated with a higher incidence of cancer, particularly some of the cancers that are high in Iowa. We know that physical exercise is important, and being fit does not eliminate your chance of getting cancer, but it certainly reduces it. There also is choice of diet, environmental issues. And I think an important research opportunity is to try to understand what is going on in Iowa relative to other states, and most importantly, how can we reverse that trend? So I don't have any unique insights into that information, but it's obviously critical that we understand it if we're going to try to do something about it.
Right. So I also don't have any scientific evidence. And let me just throw out a couple of thoughts I have and just see what you think about them. Obviously, they need more research. When I look at how Iowa differs from other states, 2 things seem to stand out to me that could be contributing. One, we are just border to border ag chemicals in terms of the amounts of pesticides, herbicides, nitrates that go into the land and then eventually find their way into the environment. So I wonder whether our huge amount of ag chemicals, which obviously do great things in terms of yield and make us really a great state for producing agriculture. But that seems to be one place where we stand out as distinct. And the other would be radon, that we are on a bed of radon that is greater than almost any other state. And we know for sure that radon increases the risk of lung cancer, but I suspect that radon is probably responsible for some other cancers. What's your thought on ag chemicals and your thoughts on radon as possibly being some of the contributors to our incidence of cancer in Iowa?
Well, I think they're candidates, and they very well could be contributing. One of the real challenges in studying these things is it's very often the exposure 2-3 decades ago that probably kicks off the cancer process. And so trying to figure out now what exposure Iowans had 20, 30 years ago that might have increased their chance of getting cancer is really challenging. Plus, we know that it's all a numbers situation, meaning that not all cancers are due to environmental factors, but some are, and figuring out which are and which aren't is really challenging. So, I think an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, and we should do everything we can to identify those chemicals that we think are carcinogenic and to control how they're used. But it's a really tough research question to crack.
Yeah. And put your hat on, your researcher hat on. So obviously there's the research you're doing that it could lead to a treatment for cancer, and partnering with pharmaceutical companies that would see a return on the investment. When somebody is trying to discover why I was number two and whether or not this egg chemical or this egg chemical may or may not be related, you're probably not going to get the egg chemicals to jump in on funding that research. What type of a researcher takes on that project, and what are some of the challenges of taking on a project like that as opposed to developing a new cancer drug?
Sure. Well, an absolutely critical group of cancer researchers nationally and in our cancer center are cancer epidemiologists who are able to look across a population, look across a state, and try to understand why cancer is more common in one population than another. Is it something in the drinking water? Is it some other exposure? And digging back to collect that data from years ago. Now, you mentioned one of the challenges, and that is that the profit margin is just not there to support that research. So it's very hard to do. Plus, if you're going to set up a study to try to understand how an exposure impacts on cancer, you're going to have to be doing that for 20, 30, 40 years. And it's kind of hard to build a career on something where you're not going to get the result until you're you're halfway through your career. So we have to figure out ways to support those kinds of databases, to support that kind of research, and to invest in it early on, because the results we get are going to be incredibly impactful, even if it takes a long time to gather the data.
Yeah.
There are many wonderful, grateful patients who have had cancer and are doing well and are really appreciate, what the medical system has done for them, and that's fantastic. Someone whose cancer was prevented because of a vaccine, HPV vaccine, or because they didn't smoke, or because of a change in the environment, doesn't know that they were a prevention success. And so it's a message that's a little more challenging to communicate.
You mentioned when we talked about what you're excited about and what you are fearful of, that access to healthcare, access to drugs. My friends at the American Cancer Society like to say cancer affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. And I know you and I and many other members, and we maybe talk a little bit about the Iowa Cancer Consortium and the role it plays, are not just scientists and doctors, but become advocates for how can we improve cancer care in Iowa, in the United States. And access to care is one of the important factors, and research is as well. We talked about that if you're coming up with a drug that might be a successful cure, you probably can partner with people who have deep pockets who might also have return on the investment. But some of the basic science or some of the epidemiology research is harder to fund. How does funding of cancer research happen at a university setting? I mean, some of it, I'm sure, comes from NCI grants. Some come from American Cancer Society grants. Some come from internal funding. Can you just share briefly how do you prepare a budget as a cancer center director for how the funds come in that actually pay for the individuals who might be doing the difficult long-term, like epidemiology research?
Oh, it's a fantastic question, and it's always a challenge. There are always more great ideas for cancer research across the full spectrum of cancer prevention, early detection, therapy, quality of life, then there are funds to support them. And the cancer center itself is not like a drug company where we control who does what research. I sometimes say we're more of a mall than a department store. Our role is to support fantastic researchers and support the ideas that they've come up with that we think are going to be impactful, and to provide the infrastructure to help them be successful and to help them serve their patients. So we try very much not to have a top-down approach to cancer research, but really a bottom-up where the new and creative ideas can come to the fore. But to do that, philanthropy is central, where people will provide us with funds to do these kind of research, pilot funds that can get ideas off the ground so the grants can be more competitive when you're finally ready to submit them. Some projects that are very challenging to get grant funding for, but are worth doing. So our sources come from philanthropy, they come from grants, some from the federal government, some from the American Cancer Society or Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and other groups that fund research. And then some that will come from pharmaceutical industry. And then we do actually take some of our clinical revenue and put that into our clinical research effort, because we know that this is part of taking care of patients. And so we reinvest those funds into doing clinical research so we can come up with better treatments. But it's one of the biggest challenges of being a cancer center director is when you have a line of people outside your door with great ideas who are looking for resources. And I got 4 people and only 1 nickel to give to one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about the concept of cancer control. So I sort of see it as the intersection of clinical medicine and public health, if you will. And I define cancer control as how can we prevent as many cancers as possible? How can we use screening and early detection to find cancers at an early stage? How can we treat cancers the best way possible? How can we provide supportive services to patients and families as they're going through their cancer journey? How can we provide ongoing survivorship care to patients who have been cured of their cancer, and to those patients who might be living with incurable cancer? How can we support them all the way through death, and maybe even how do we support their families after death? Yeah. So cancer control is really that whole spectrum that is not just about treating cancer, but is really everything from preventing to supporting. You and I happen to belong to an organization that is Iowa's designated cancer control organization that gets funding from the Center for Disease Control through the Department of HHS. Maybe explain what the Iowa Cancer Consortium is and what role it plays in helping with cancer control in the state of Iowa.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a spectacular organization, and it's been wonderful to be part of it since actually it was initiated. So I'm going to take a step back and say there are really 2 things we need to do to reduce the burden of cancer for those we serve. The first is create the evidence of what we should do, figure out what we should do. And that begins with basic research. That includes clinical research, but that also includes, caring for the psychosocial needs of patients and developing evidence that will tell us what's the best thing to do for a given patient or a given group of patients. But doing that is not enough if you don't get that evidence and apply it in the community. So cancer control is applying evidence-based approaches to reducing the burden of cancer across the full spectrum that you talked about. And that's what the Iowa Cancer Consortium is really focused on, saying, okay, we know what works. We know what works for prevention. We know what works for early detection, this screening. We know what works for therapy, and we know what works for improving quality of life, at least in some cases. Let's be sure we apply what we already know to help people. And in fact, well over a third of the burden of cancer and cancer deaths occurs not because we don't know what to do, it's because we're not doing what we already know what to do. So cancer control is absolutely vital if we're to reduce the burden of cancer by applying what we already know that we have evidence for to help people.
You're right. That's such a good point. I mean, one study I saw that 42% of all cancers in the United States are caused by modifiable risk factors, meaning if we had done everything we knew, like if all of us were really good about diet and not smoking and exercise and stress reduction and getting vaccinated, we could prevent as many as 42% of cancers and something like 45% of cancer deaths. But everybody thinks research is coming up with another pill as opposed to putting into effect the things we already know.
There's actually a type of research that is really important called implementation research. And that's research exploring how do you get these ideas out into the community where they help. So it's no less cancer research than what I do with genes and the immune system. It's really, again, learning how to work within society to reduce the burden of cancer by helping people do what they need to do and helping society do what it needs to do as well.
Okay. So George, if you're game, we're going to open up to questions. So we've got a live studio audience here. We also have individuals that are watching us right now live streaming. If you're one of those watching us live streaming, you can put your questions in the comments section. But we're going to start off first with our live studio audience. Poon.
Yes. Is there any of your research that's going on to help with side effects of chemo and radiation?
Yes, there is. My goal is for chemo and radiation to be of historical interest only. So I would like to put myself and Dick out of business when it comes to using those approaches. But there is research into understanding how can we make the cancer cells more sensitive to those treatments while the normal cells are protected from them. And some of this includes looking at ways to prevent sores in the mouth from developing secondary to radiation or chemo, or the drop in blood counts. So there's a lot of active research in that area. But in fact, the solution may come from finding more targeted, specific approaches to treating cancer. But we do need to try to reduce the side effects before we get to that wonderful day when we can do away with these types of treatments. It's a great question.
And just to add to that, in the last 10 years, we're starting to see clinical trials. So for most of my career, clinical trials was how much more treatment can we give that might increase the cure. We now have some forms of early stage breast cancer and Hodgkin's disease where the cure rate is so good, you're not going to make it better. So we're actually doing research to see, can we back off on the treatment without adversely affecting the excellent cure rate. So by backing off and giving less chemo, giving less radiation, or maybe no radiation in certain situations. So there's actually clinical trials intended to be comparable. And what we hope to see is that if the trial is a success, we have equal cure rate, but we have less treatment, so fewer side effects. So that's a whole type of research design that didn't exist 20 years ago.
The classic example of that is the radical mastectomy that used to be done for women with breast cancer. And it was very hard to move away from that until some really wonderful doctors and patient advocates made the case that we don't need to do that kind of disfiguring surgery for women. That in fact, we can be much more targeted and focused, and the outcomes are just as good, but the quality of life is better. Really important point.
Yeah, great point. Another question? Yes, Corey.
Yeah, so you had mentioned that you have tons of researchers knocking at your door, but you have limited funds as to disperse out to your different researchers. How do you determine or make a decision who gets funding, and kind of how do those ideas that you think are the most likely to succeed, how do you kind of pull those out from the group of researchers knocking at your door?
Yeah. Well, the most common approach we use is we have what we call a peer review system where people will write the grant, write the idea down, and then we'll get a group of us together in a room that'll sit down and talk through each grant. What are the pros? What are the cons? What can we learn from it? What are the chances of getting more resources to advance the idea further? And we'll score them, and we'll support the ones that got the best scores. And we include patient advocates in this discussion as well. So we'll ask the patients saying, which research idea do you think is most valuable moving forward? Now, there are times when we identify a need more globally and centrally, for a piece of equipment or to recruit somebody with a particular expertise, in which case we'll go ahead and just go ahead and use the resources we have for that purpose. But we try to pick the projects that are reviewed by experts as being the most likely to be successful.
Okay, thank you. Yes, George.
The question is, how do you answer the cynics that say a disproportionate amount of the cost falls on you, on the researchers for the development of treatments and drugs, and the profit then is peeled away by the corporations? Does that need rebalancing? And also,
I'm not able to hear.
Okay. So the question was, this is one of the questions from one of our online viewers, is how do you answer the cynic who might say that the government and the universities are bearing all the costs of the research, and then the pharmaceutical companies are reaping all the benefits financially?
I partially agree with it. I think one aspect, the pharmaceutical companies do invest very, very heavily in research, but they also invest as much in marketing. And I am a fan of limiting marketing of these companies. They shouldn't be spending money on TV ads talking about Keytruda. They should be spending money on helping researchers do research and helping patients access these drugs for lower costs. So I think we need companies. I think they do incredible good, but I think there would be ways as a society that we could reinvest more.
Okay. We have time for one more question. So it's kind of like you choosing the researcher. There's lots of questions. I got to choose the best one here. So who's got a really good question for the final question? Here we go. Chris has one.
Dr. Weiner, please give us a sense of how big the Holden Cancer Center operation is. How many researchers, how many patients do you see in a year?
Sure.
Kind of the general scope of how big the whole entire entity is.
Sure. Well, I'll start out by saying we're what's called a matrix cancer center, and that we're embedded within the university as a whole. So we work with, we have researchers from 6 colleges, 36 departments. So we focus on the mission more than the organization. We have one category that's helpful that I can use, and that's our cancer center members. And these are researchers who are leading their own research programs. And we have about 160 members now. And again, some of them are doctors taking care of patients, some are basic scientists, some are faculty in the College of Nursing or pharmacy or public health or dentistry. So they're very varied folks there. We take care of approximately 3,000 to 3,000 or 3,500 new cancer cases a year. From people mostly from Iowa, but some from other areas as well. So that gives you an idea of the volume of patients. We also very often will see patients and refer them back to their communities if the therapy that they need can be delivered closer to home. So part of what we do also is serve as a referral center to give second opinions and to provide advice so that patients can get care from the wonderful doctors they have at home for those rare cancers or those cases that are particularly challenging.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. George Weiner, Director Emeritus of Holden Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Iowa, and the CE Block Chair of Cancer Research. Thank you for all you've done for Iowa over your career, and I'm happy that you're still doing the research and still involved in many aspects of advocacy in the state of Iowa. And hopefully you've given up some of the more headachy parts of your job so you can do your last part of your career with all the things you love to do.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate your partnership through the years. And we need to go above and beyond and keep doing what we're doing.
Great. Thanks, George.
Okay.
And thanks, everybody, for watching. If you know someone that would benefit by watching this, it will be available on demand tomorrow at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel or the Mercy One Cancer Center website. I hope you'll join us again next week. Thanks, everyone.